So I was scrolling through the news the other day, and I couldn't help but notice something wild. President Biden's been handing out pardons like it's free pizza day at a college dorm. Now, I've always heard about presidential pardons. Trump made headlines, Obama raised debates, but I think the craziest one definitely has to be President Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. And it's not just about the act itself, but the story behind it. Did you know that Nixon's time in Washington wasn't just about Watergate? There's this whole subplot involving milk, lobbying, and corruption so deep that it reshaped how power works in America. Yeah, you heard me right, milk. If you're interested in why or how that even happened, I encourage you to listen to a podcast series called Master Plan by The Lever. It's a podcast series where investigative journalism peels back decades of oligarchs scheming to make corruption not just possible, but perfectly legal. And I'll link the series in the description below. Long story short, here's the thing. Some of these pardons that Biden gave out also don't exactly scream model citizen. Case in point, remember the Kids for Cash scandal? Yeah, the lawyer who was involved in funneling children into private prisons for kickbacks? Yeah, pardoned. Let that sink in for a second. It got me thinking, how did we get here? Why do presidents even have this unseemingly checked power to pardon people? And more importantly, how has this power been used, and let's be real, abused throughout history? Presidential pardons are one of those things you just hear about in passing, but when you dig a little bit deeper, they're kind of fascinating. They're baked into the Constitution, but are they really still appropriate in today's world? Should one person have the power to override the justice system with the stroke of a pen? What are the checks on this, if any? And brace yourself, how do we stop situations where this power is used to serve political interests instead of justice? That's the question that's just been buzzing around my brain for the last month or so, and I figured this would be the perfect topic to dive into. Now, everything I've just told you about is drawing on the news that I've read recently, the podcasts that I've listened to, and some basic surface level research that I've done online. I've not even gone into the primary research softwares, but I do want to go deeper into the research and narrow my scope. I don't want to just ask the big questions. I'm trying to figure out how to turn them into an argument that could actually make a difference. Let's dive into the fascinating world of presidential pardons. These aren't just some obscure legal footnote, it's in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2 gives the president the authority to grant pardons for federal offenses. But why? Well, the founding fathers had some pretty noble intentions. And as I went in and did a little bit more research, I found that originally, pardons were meant to show mercy, fix judicial mistakes, or help bring the country together during divisive times. It's a way for the executive branch to act as a check on the judicial system. Sounds great in theory, right? But here's where things get messy. Throughout history, we've seen some seriously controversial pardons that make you question if this power is being used as intended, like the Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon in 1974, which caused huge uproar. Many people felt like it undermined accountability. Or even the Kids for Cash scandal, like I just talked about. Many of those kids' lives were permanently altered because of the insane conditions they were subject to in the prisons. These examples really highlight the tension between the idealistic origins of pardons and how they can play out in reality. This is not really important, but just something I thought was worth noting, that the frequency of pardons varies widely between administrations, whether they're Democrat or Republican. President Clinton granted 396 pardons during his 2 terms, while George W. Bush issued 200. And then there's Trump, who gave out 143 pardons, including some pretty high-profile cases. So this inconsistency raises questions about how this power is being wielded, and I can kind of see that it's not specific to just one party. But here's the thing. There aren't really any formal checks on presidential pardon power. It's basically up to the president's discretion. The lack of oversight has a lot of legal scholars worried. Some argue it's an essential part of our justice system, allowing for mercy in correcting errors, while others warn that it can lead to abuses of power and undermine the rule of law. These concerns have all led to calls for reform. And as I'm skimming through primary research softwares, I'm noticing that some experts are pushing for clear guidelines and limitations, especially for politically charged cases. Ideas like creating a bipartisan commission to review pardons or requiring more transparency in the decision-making process are being floated. I noticed that they weren't talking purely just about getting it removed as a whole, but why don't we just get rid of it like I originally wanted to write about when I first dove into my research? Was there something I wasn't really thinking about? So we're kind of left with a complex issue that touches on fundamental questions of justice, accountability, and the balance of power in our government. How do we reconcile that noble intent of pardons with the potential for misuse? It's a thorny problem, but that's exactly what makes it such a rich topic for legal analysis and debate. You've heard the controversies, you've seen the headlines, and now you're probably thinking, this isn't right. Something needs to change. But where do you even begin? How do you take a sprawling issue like presidential pardons and transform it into a focused, persuasive legal argument? Let's break it down. The first step is to frame your burning question. Instead of asking, should presidential pardons exist, which is way too broad, we need to narrow it down. How about this? How can constitutional reforms limit the misuse of presidential pardon power? You see the difference? We've gone from a yes or no question to something a little bit more nuanced that demands analysis and solutions. Now, here's where the real work begins. You need to find out what's already been said on this topic. This is where tools like Nexus Uni and JSTOR become your best friends. When I started digging into presidential pardons, I found tons of articles about high-profile cases, but not much on actual reform proposals, or at least as much. And that's a gap that I think I could fill. So as you're researching, you'll find conflicting viewpoints. I encourage you, do not shy away from them. Embrace them. These are actually going to be the most important viewpoints to you. Some scholars argue that pardons are essential for mercy in correcting judicial mistakes. Others say they're prone to abuse. Your job should be to acknowledge both sides and then stake out your own position. It's very easy to be exclusively on one side or the other, but it's a lot harder to try and find a reasonable middle ground. So let's put this all together into a thesis statement. The constitutional power of presidential pardons, while rooted in principles of mercy, requires modern reforms to prevent abuses and uphold justice. So this thesis does three things. It acknowledges the original intent of pardons, points out the problem, and hints at a solution. It's a sound thesis, but throughout the paper, because I said it's rooted in principles of mercy, I need to support it with clear historical evidence. And because I said it requires modern reforms, the reader is probably going to also want to see specific reform proposals. So I need to make sure that all of that is evident throughout my entire paper. Remember, this process isn't just for presidential pardons. You can use this framework on any legal topic that gets your blood boiling. Start with your outrage, refine it into a specific question, research the gaps, consider multiple perspectives, and then craft a thesis that captures the complexity of the issue. The key is to keep pushing past your initial reactions. It's easy to say, this is wrong. It's harder and more valuable to ask, how can we make this right? That's the difference between just being angry and actually contributing to the legal discourse. I've noticed that the most influential people tend to be the best communicators. So, what issue are you passionate about? How can you turn that passion into a compelling legal argument? Now that we've got our topic and thesis, it's time to dive into the research. Trust me, this is where the magic happens. So let's start with Nexus Uni and JSTOR. These are going to be the gold mines of legal research. When I searched presidential pardon reform on Nexus Uni, I found a treasure chest of just case law and scholarly articles. A pro tip is try to use the filters to narrow down your results by date and relevance. It helps a lot. But here's the real key: synthesis. It's not enough to just collect information. You need to connect the dots, identify common themes, and create something new. As you read, look for patterns and contradictions. Maybe one scholar argues for stricter oversight while another warns against limiting executive power. Your job is to weigh these arguments and develop your own position. Don't be afraid to use advanced search techniques like Boolean operators. In your search bar, you can type in things like and, or, and not, and this can really help you find exactly what you're looking for. Another thing that I think is super cool is tools like Roper iPoll can help you integrate public opinion data into your argument. Imagine backing up your call for pardon reform with stats showing widespread public concerns about abuse of power. Like, wow, next level argumentation and support, right? Remember, good research is the backbone of impactful legal writing. It takes practice, but with each paper, you'll get better at turning ideas into compelling arguments. Now, keep in mind, this presidential pardon thing was oversimplified for the purpose of the video. You want to try and dive as deep as you can into the issue that you're researching. I would try to narrow your scope or find a unique angle if you're writing about something that's already been talked about. Make sure that your writing is rooted in your research. After all, it is a research paper. So dive in, get your hands dirty with those sources, and start building your case.